where the world population has doubled of energy system is to ensure energy can be delivered to consumers, industrial customers and others at a point in time, at an acceptable cost. Control of energy use much more carefully will have important implications on the overall energy efficiency and demand for energy. And when it comes to productivity, in the last 45 years, productivity grew at a level equal, essentially, to the rate of population growth. And that's what lies behind a near 3.5% per annum growth worldwide in technology, in GDP. But there's a fierce debate underway at the moment about how much productivity is possible with the new technologies. Some, and Robert Gordon, for example, in his seminal book on the rise and fall of the US economy, is somebody who believes that this level of productivity per annum could be really as low as 1%, and possibly in the US substantially lower. Whereas the techno-optimists think of much more is possible, and they point to the quick diffusion of ideas, the possibility that we would have high levels of productivity going forward. This is a critical uncertainty that lies behind the range of GDP figures that we look at. But it's not just pace of innovation and productivity. Equally important is the development of international governance and geopolitical change. Effectively, as we move the center of gravity of the global economy more towards Asia, and as we see the pressure for geopolitical change, the question emerges is, can this change take place smoothly? Will the international system hold together, or is it likely to be fractured and become problematic? It ought to be clear these are exactly the issues that we have to think about when we address an issue like climate change. And then there's the question of what priority will be given to issues like sustainability and the climate. There's no universal position on this. There's been a strong push towards sustainability. But even when there's an agreement, as we saw in COP21, it transpires maybe a year or two later with a new set of politicians in power that these things can change. And then of particular interest to energy people, because the tools we select to act have important consequences for the energy industry, the way it's structured, the way it operates, and both the challenges that it has. Perhaps the two that are most important are the contrast between states, particularly state directives, and those that have strong affinity to market solutions. As you can see, there is a coherence in state directions. It's around taxes and subsidies. It's about an emphasis on public research and development. It's around stylized regulation, the importance of education. The real aim is around national and sector planning. It's about public investment, and it has a particular role for state companies. You can contrast that with a market-oriented approach which emphasizes efficiency and competition, the private research and development, innovation as a focus, training, corporate vision and planning being particularly important, perhaps global in scope, and it's about private investment, private corporations. The question is which tools will be dominant, and these are not issues that can be answered just theoretically. They depend on culture, they depend on experience. Some types of problems are easier to solve with one set of tools than another. I think the question as a pragmatist is the one that Deng Xiaoping reminded us of in a particular way as the Chinese economy was beginning to move underway in the 1980s. It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And that's probably as good a philosophy as any. Being supremely pragmatic and yet honoring where we come from without turning to ideology as the basis for action. So with that in mind, let me say a little bit about the three scenarios that were developed and launched in Istanbul in October last year. We developed three scenarios. You'll see straight away the names are musical in nature. The aim of naming scenarios is to give people a sense of the rhythm, the dynamics, the nature of the environment. It's not just a rational activity of saying that this is the size of the system. Modern jazz represents what we would call a digitally disruptive, highly innovative and market-driven world. It's a very modern future. When you think of jazz, you think of improvisation, many different instruments working together, creating something that's special, unique, the ability to work in harmony together, and yet, nevertheless, there's a distinct element of competition. Unfinished symphony is a world in which more intelligent and sustainable economic growth becomes the focus of developments. It's driving, if we look at the energy issues, very much to a low carbon energy future. But the full job of meeting COP21 is not going to be easy. This is a symphony, it's orchestrated, there are many different players. Think of COP21 with nigh on a couple of 200 countries, each saying what they would contribute, working together. Ideally in a symphony it is concluded, but even COP21 itself is a challenge in terms of meeting these targets, 2 degrees centigrade. And then a future which the teams involved agonized over. Hard rock, it's dissonant, it's abrasive, it's lacking in harmony, it's aggressive music. This is about a more fragmented approach driven by the desire for energy security. It's much more inward looking. It's a world that's emerging, some people believe it's here, perhaps as a competitor to the other two. This is the point of scenarios. Each world can be developed as a plausible, challenging entity in its own right, but we don't know which one will emerge. And if we're true to the situation, we have the possibility to create the future we want. If we could organize ourselves to do that. Sometimes, of course, it's not as easy as that. So I think with this as a background, let me turn to the region. the way we look at the world is strongly shaped by what is currently going on. And I'm sure, at least if I look at myself, you come back in 2 or 3 years, you'll be seeing different things as important. So let's have a look at the issues that matter. The first issue that comes up, I don't have every country in the region here, and this is taken from the IMF and the World Energy Outlook database. It's worth having a look. The first obvious issue is that there are a number of countries that have had particular difficulties in the last 2 years, Venezuela, Brazil as examples. And this really goes back to the dependence on commodities and the commodity cycle. The very factors that gave rise to the fall were implicit in the rise of the GDP in the decade or so before 2014. But of course the good news is if you look increasingly across the region, there are economies that have decoupled or have even benefited from the reduction in commodity prices. And you can look at successful countries in Central America, the Caribbean, and as we move into South America, we can include countries like Bolivia, Paraguay, Peru, here, Colombia, Uruguay, and Chile, all on balance growing at around 4% or so per annum, if not higher. Therefore, as you would expect, if you move around the region, you'll see very different perspectives on the issues of the day and the potential for the future. If we turn to energy, what we see is a region that in relative terms, looking at other developing countries, has done remarkably well. Pretty close to energy access being close to 100%. There are just under 20 million people who still lack access to electricity. But if we look at this remarkable set of experiences from 2000 to 2014, you can see some remarkable success. Now, if you want to delve into this in more detail, when you look at the current analysis coming out of the World Energy Council's Energy Monitor of issues, there are some challenges that remain, in particular to ensure energy is adequately affordable. Having access is not all it's cut out to be if in fact energy is too expensive. Part of the reason for the success in some countries has been a fairly high level of subsidies. This itself brings challenges. For the obvious reason that if you subsidize heavily and your fundamental economic strength suffers, you're left with enormous commitments. And the example of some of those countries at the top here, Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, El Salvador, 3 countries with over 2% or more of GDP being spent on subsidies and a very significant proportion of tax revenue. You're better off in many respects, but it requires careful management to achieve equity through other means than just through subsidies. And we look around the world, I won't go into that in detail, we see many other countries that are trying to do what we've seen many in the region do, and that is reduce subsidy levels, particularly in the context of lower crude oil and natural gas prices. And if we look at the issues that matter, I've pulled this out of the issues monitor from this year. We can see where energy leaders in the region see some of the current issues. Looking at here are some obvious ones around economic growth and commodity pricing being of both here high impact and relatively uncertain. Surprisingly, we have emerging interest around innovative transport, and in particular, which is unique to the region, and that's really in the context of the recent El Nino, is around the effects of extreme weather. And on top of that, of course, other climatic events which really have raised concerns. I've also included here the positioning of regional integration, because that's an issue I want to come back and explore in the context of the scenarios later. And I mentioned the concern here in the region about extreme weather. If you look at this map here, it has both countries and energy sectors worldwide. And here you have Latin America and the Caribbean. What you see is the issue is both high in the need for action and also some issues around the uncertainty as well. Why has it been important? It's because of the enormous emphasis on hydropower in the region. And for hydropower to work, you need some degree of understanding of the climatic conditions, and in particular precipitation. What we've seen, for example, if we look across the region from intense rains in this region to scarce precipitation on in the Amazon area, severe droughts where they were not expected, and down here, extraordinary amounts of rain. Now, obviously, when you're designing a connected set of hydropower plants with other energy-based, perhaps fossil fuel-based plants, you need to be able to know you can manage through the year. And this is perhaps the point about climate change. We know the regularities from the past. We know that something's going to be different in the future, but as we travel from where we are to the future, what are the regularities on which we can pin our operating activities to? If we look at the largest country in the region, what we see is, again, understandably, in Brazil, a focus here around economic growth and commodity pricing, important drivers of the economy, the current set of concerns on corruption in the industry, and the emerging set of issues around electricity storage, partly in the context of the climatic issues I mentioned. And at the moment, less of an emphasis on the positioning of regional integration. Just to make the point about regional integration, what we see here are two maps, one of them on electricity interconnection and the other on gas pipelines. There are, in fact, and I'm sure we'll hear from our colleague later, there are many projects around that focus on the increasing interconnection of electric networks and the opportunities that may well be there for extended gas pipelines. I won't go into this in detail. I will pick up the issue as we talk about the Latin America, Caribbean scenarios. So with that as a sort of basis for thinking about some of the issues that seem to be shaping minds at the moment, let's have a look at the Latin American and Caribbean scenarios and the key descriptors. Firstly, we have a number of predetermined elements. I mentioned slower population growth, but in a surprising way, it's even more intense in parts of the region than it is for the world as a whole. We're looking at Brazil's population growth rate dropping from 1.7% per annum historically, last 45 years, to around 0.3% per annum in what would be a rapidly aging society. And elsewhere in the region, we're looking at faster population growth, but still much lower than anything we've seen in the past. The full range of technologies that I mentioned in talking about the world scenarios are available here. They're accessible in many different ways. So those technologies have yet to be fully applied, or even in significant ways to be applied. But we can well expect, particularly in an innovative world, why wouldn't we be innovative in this region? Thirdly, the vulnerability to climate change is unlikely to go away. And the question, of course, when we look at the scenarios, how vulnerable? And again, the shifts in economic power, the rise of China, which has been in many ways already influential in the development of agricultural products as markets for minerals and so on. I mentioned modern jazz, unfinished symphony, and hard rock. These scenarios tell us something about how we navigate the grand transition. In this region, selected by the teams, our colleagues from across the region, they chose samba as something more distinct for the region than modern jazz. The music, the flamboyance, the competition of the teams, the movement, the creativity. Samba is highly productive, highly creative, highly challenging. We'll talk about it in a moment. Tango, much more carefully movements, perhaps led by government, but with industry and others working in unison, more structured. And rock, dissonant, challenging, local, inward-looking. Let's talk a little bit about some of the elements. This is about a scenario where the region is shaped by successful reforms. It's about strong innovation. It's highly coupled to the outside world. Not only that, that coupling means that there are opportunities worldwide for developments in the region. It's not about importing, it's about finding that right balance. It's about in some ways, a preparedness to allow the openness of a market to succeed. And it's challenging because not everybody can succeed in this sort of environment, and the social issues will be challenging. It's about much more rapid economic diversification of the region's economies beyond commodities. It's about, on the energy front, energy affordability for all. It's about valuing developments which meet the needs of all, not just those in the middle class and above. The world of tango, a region that is shaped by governments, pragmatic, intelligent governments, with a purpose of achieving some form of sustainable growth and a resilient energy system. This is a world which can look forward, can sustain decisions for quite a long period and take a social perspective. It values regional integration and with it more substantial regional governance. It's prepared to enforce tough rules, regulations. It's about high investment. And it's not just around mitigation projects. It's particularly around adjusting to handle, for example, some of the challenges we saw around hydropower and the shifting in climate. And lastly, in rock, it's more inward-looking. It's about the challenges of dealing with low productivity. So with low productivity and low economic growth, we don't have an economy that can generate the sort of capacity to invest that we see in samba and tango. So with that in mind, let us move this forward and examine both the key findings globally and contrast them with the key findings for the region itself. Perhaps the biggest headline that was received after the Istanbul Congress was the focus on the finding that the world's primary energy demand growth will slow. Per capita energy demand will peak before 2030. And this is really to do with a set of factors which are different in each scenario. In modern jazz, what we're looking at are very high levels of innovation and productivity, and it's difficult to believe that these would not be translated into the energy sector. But they also might be driven by much tougher regulation in Unfinished Symphony, which is really trying to drive towards this low carbon future. Or it might also be equally driven by a hard rock scenario, where we're looking at substantially more challenging environment. If that's the situation for the world, when we look at the LAC region, what we see is a real contrast with recent experience. Primary energy demand in LAC grew at around 3.2% per annum in the 14 years from the year 2000. But when we look forward, it's expected to grow at a substantially lower rate, somewhere in the order of 1.6 to 1.9% per annum from to 2030, and even slower from 2030 to 2060. All of this is due in part to the lower, particularly in samba and tango scenarios, the lower level of energy intensity. And these low levels of energy intensity are not repeated in hard rock, which is performing rather similar to historical experience. In the region, we're looking at the demand for electricity to grow quite substantially. In the global scenarios, we were looking at around a doubling of electricity across each of the scenarios. Part of this is to do with the increasing urbanization that's underway. Technology-enabled urban lifestyles demand electricity. This is about the growth of the middle class, rising incomes, and more electricity-enabled appliances and machines. So this is very difficult to push back. This is almost something which is like a tide that drives across all regions. The demand for electricity in LAC rises, as we can see here, at 2.3 to 2.7 times to 2060. This is in line, as I said, with global developments. Through to 2030, when we look at how that electricity will be met, we're looking at hydro dominating nude power generation growth, with 40 to 65% of the generation increment. Beyond 2030, the new generation increment is dominated by natural gas, wind, solar, and others. So we're looking at a changing structure of the industry. Wind and solar shares in LAC will increase but stay below global averages. They're coming from a substantially lower base. What we're looking at, as I mentioned, is the important increase in solar and wind. The solar in particular is potentially complementary to hydropower development. When we look into the sector, the sort of funding required in the period to 2060 is between 2 to 2.5 trillion US dollars based on a 2010 market exchange rate. If we look to fossil fuels, firstly, worldwide, we're looking at an important shift underway here. Demand peaks for coal and oil have the potential to not only have stranded assets at the corporate level, but raise the challenge for some countries of stranded resources. Coal and potentially oil that one would have expected to be produced that will now not be produced. The momentum of new technologies and renewable energy generation results in the fossil fuel share of primary energy falling to 70% by 2060. In hard rock, we're looking at this sort of level, and somewhat lower in modern jazz. Coal peaks around the 2020 area in modern jazz, and oil at around 2030. You can see that here. Oil will have some particularly challenging times. In a way, the coal issue is important for Colombia and Chile, but less of an issue perhaps elsewhere. Important, and this is difficult to shift given the changing structure of demand, is an increasing role for natural gas. And natural gas demand continues to rise at varying rates across the period to 2060. If we go into the Latin America and Caribbean region, what we're looking at here is oil demand, as we can see here, rising up to the 2030 area, and then the beginning of peaking and stabilization in rock. And the natural gas figures as indicated. In transport, we're looking at a rapid development, particularly in biofuels. This is an important set of developments. It's interesting that this is almost exceptional to the region. When we look at the global developments, what we're looking at more significantly is the rapid rise in electric vehicles. perhaps of the 3 billion vehicles by 2060, we would see in tango and equivalent of tango, Unfinished Symphony and modern jazz, would see around a third of them, some 1 billion electric vehicles. The electricity transport energy in LAC is expected to grow, but nevertheless remain substantially below, as I've said, the global picture. If we turn now to global warming, at the global level, you can see here, if we look at what needs to be achieved in order to achieve the 2-degree centigrade target, we're looking at Unfinished Symphony moving well down that line, the tango equivalent at the global level, and modern jazz following, perhaps with a delay here of around 15 years. And hard rock, very much inwardly focused on balance, with a focus on the development, continued development of and replacement of fossil fuel plants. And if we look at the region is perhaps the best performing anyway worldwide on this issue. And the challenge here is to handle in tango the turn down. So the projects put in place to achieve that, we see in rock increasing and a turn down around 2050 in Sambla. So let me turn really to regional integration across the scenario. When we look at Sambla, what we're really concerned about here are focusing on projects which are particularly profitable, can lower overall costs to the energy system. And this could happen in a wide variety of forms. When we look at tango, we're looking here at multilateral arrangements, probably in the context of a wider set of regional agreements. It's about collective security, resilience of energy and environmental systems. And ideally, of course, these are also quite profitable as well. And behind this would be a commitment not only to address climate change, to be able to handle the challenges the climate has for the region, and with a much more restricted set of opportunities in hard rock. It's perhaps worth having a perspective on regional energy integration, and I'm going to cover some of the issues that we raised in Cartagena, and also that have been reinforced by this work. I think the first thing, given the economic difficulty in some areas, is to get a handle going forward on what's required for successful economic development. And energy regional integration can make an important contribution to economic success. The right projects at the right costs, providing benefits. Secondly, successful economic development itself is a precursor to successful energy policy, regardless of who is leading. You need to have the capacity to invest, and that comes with effective economic situation. It also can offer more resilient growth. One of the issues that emerged quite a number of times, and I've reiterated here, is around building resilient energy systems. Fourthly, regional interconnections and eventually integration requires trust. It's deeply dependent upon public consensus, social acceptance, and that, of course, is very challenging and all parts of the region will find it easy to work with others. But that has to be, of course, worked on. And to succeed is not just about ideology and politics. It's about competence, it's about leadership, and it's about the capacity to see and promote projects which will make a difference across the region. Let me move to conclusion really with some of the recommendations that have come out of discussions of this work. I think firstly, the importance of clarity on government policy directions. The first one is the recognition of the need for large-scale investments in infrastructure. When you look at it more broadly, the developments that are needed across the region, they're not, of course, just in energy. They're about roads and ports. Energy is but one factor. Communications. It's about the development of habitable cities and their development. And city development is surely going to be an important issue. This will require some government leadership in areas like structural reforms, the role of the private sector, the ability to develop and source the necessary funding. And in that context, there is important scope for regional integration. Secondly, and this comes up really in the individual sectoral discussions, there are new opportunities that are beginning to emerge. Firstly, on the demand side, the future of cities in the region looms large. I mentioned it a few moments ago. And the challenge is to be able to both have successful example, which is available for others in the region to follow, and perhaps ideally a model for those outside. And then, of course, at the sectoral level, wind, solar, possibly geothermal, continued growth in biofuels and natural gas, particularly in the latter part of the period. Thirdly, climate-related policies. What we need to understand is this is, of course, a key concern in the region. And the region itself has been an important shaper and proponent of global climate policy. One would see that as being something that continues. And lastly, and this is, of course, the point of the scenarios, we're not without risks. If there's a rapid turn down in demand for fossil fuel, there's a need to adequately adjust economies to prepare for that where appropriate. And equally, the issue of moving into a ROC environment, there's a strong argument that says that regions should try to focus on policies and roadmaps that take them more towards a tango or samba future, if this is at all possible. To conclude, I started by saying the last 45 years will not provide the basis for moving forward. And I would like to believe these scenarios have tried to give us a sense of where we might be going and how different that might be. We are on the cusp, I believe, of quite fundamental change. Sometimes we don't see it because we're overwhelmed by circumstances in the present. But the challenge of the world's industry leaders and within the region is a difficult one. It's to maintain the current integrity of the energy systems, but steer us towards this new transformed future. This requires a reconsideration of policy, strategy, thinking about novel and risky investments. It will require human ingenuity and leadership. And I wish you well in contributing to such a future. So with that, I'd like to stop and thank you for your patience. Thank you.